Hello and welcome to a special preview of the week in 60 Minutes, which will air in full tonight at 6 p.m. on Spectator TV. Following the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, I've spoken to the Spectator's Russia correspondent Owen Matthews. You can watch that clip in full here and see the show tonight at 6 p.m. on Spectator TV. Hi, Owen. Thanks for joining Spectator TV. You say in your piece for Coffee House that Yevgeny Prigozhin was a dead man walking. Why was that?
Well, for a very simple reason that if you defy someone as who had the track record of murder and violence like Vladimir Putin, who's either directly or indirectly killed so many of his opponents, if you actually come after a man like that in an armed insurrection, I mean, it's pretty clear that the stakes cannot have been higher for him. It's kind of amazing that he survived the Prigozhin survived the mutiny. It's amazing that he was allowed to sort of walk the earth, especially the Russian earth, in the 2 months intervening. So in that sense, Prigozhin's death is probably like the least surprising news story of the year.
From Putin's perspective, Owen, to what extent did the Wagner chief still represent a threat? Or was killing Prigozhin simply an act of revenge for the attempted coup several months back?
Well, I think both. The threat part, I think, has actually been more or less neutralized insofar as that Wagner was partially the Wagner troops that rebelled under Prigozhin's orders back in June have been scattered. Some of them have gone to Belarus, some of them have gone to Africa. We don't know how many have joined up various regular Russian army units like Redut, which is a Russian army unit set up especially for former prisoners. So I don't think Prigozhin was necessarily a military threat, but the fact that he was still at liberty was a sort of living proof of Putin's weakness. And in that sense, the really important question is, how much of his supporters are still out there. I mean, there's been some chat on pro-Wagner Telegram groups saying, we will get revenge. We've had a plan, for this eventuality, watch out, Kremlin. We have no idea how serious those are. I think most people discount the possibility of a second Wagner mutiny, just Wagner. But the bigger question is, what about all the soldiers, generals, and officers, security service people, bloggers who supported Prigozhin? And why did they support Prigozhin? They supported Prigozhin because Prigozhin, they thought, was the only guy really fighting a serious war in Ukraine, while all the rest were being incompetent and stealing, which is probably true. Some kind of new head of this Hydra is kind of going to be dangerous and threatening to Putin going forward, because if the war doesn't go very well, there's going to be other people who thought like Prigozhin did, and we can't exclude that they're going to appear on the political scene at some point in the future.
Well, that was my next question to you. Does this death leave an opening for somebody even more frightening to come in?
Yes, it certainly does. The most dangerous opposition to Putin is not liberals and anti-war voices like Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader who's been spent 2 years in jail. That's not the dangerous opposition. The dangerous opposition are the ultra-nationalists and the hawks, who argue that Putin is sort of pussyfooting about and not doing enough to prosecute the Ukraine war. And they've been the most vocal opponents of Putin, the most vocal critics. One of their most prominent voices of the ultra-nationalists is a guy called Igor Strilkov. His real name is Girkin, former defense minister of the separatist Donetsk People's Republic. And he was jailed last month. So that guy has been shut down. But there is a large, we don't know how large, but definitely vocal community of nationalists in Russia who actually have strong ties and support in the armed forces. We know that. So they're armed, they're angry, and they are opposed to Putin. So the last showdown was obviously the Prigozhin mutiny. It failed. Putin won. He survived. Prigozhin's dead. Putin is not. So that round goes to Putin. But I think the big takeaway for anyone who has plans to challenge Putin from the Prigozhin mutiny is that Putin's word means nothing. Putin gave his word to Prigozhin. That was the reason why he was in Russia. He just thought, Prigozhin thought that it was going to be business as usual. It was definitely not business as usual. He seems to be the only person in the world that kind of considered Putin's word to be good, and Putin broke it. So the real takeaway is, if you come at the Tsar, you better finish the job next time round.
Oh, and you mentioned before that Prigozhin still walking around Russia would have represented a symbol of sorts for Putin of his own weakness. Is that why we saw such a public assassination? Putin's regime has made us very familiar with the concept of accidental deaths, but this was extremely public. Was he trying to make a statement?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, there is something deliberately performative about this spectacular act of violence. I mean, he wasn't just, poisoned. He wasn't, killed in a car crash. Prigozhin was literally blown out of the sky. So there's, clear symbolism to that. Part of the symbolism is this was apparently, I mean, we don't know quite yet, but I mean, there have been witness reports that suggest that there were 2 anti-aircraft missiles that downed Prigozhin's plane. So it's like the military killed Prigozhin. So that's a symbolism. He was killed, violently in a fireball, along with many of the senior members of the Wagner group, notably Dmitry Utkin, formerly the commander and head of Wagner group, whose call sign Wagner is actually because he's an enthusiastic Nazi. You may have noticed that actually late Putin Russia seems to share a casting director with like the Lord of the Rings, because these people are like incredibly terrifying looking. Dmitry Utkin literally looks like the king of the orcs and has swastika SS swastika flashes tattooed on his collarbone. Prigozhin, as we know, also looks pretty scary. But all of these people were traveling together. All of the top Wagner people, they were killed in one, what military people call a decapitation strike. But of course, it's quite telling that the most successful decapitation strikes that the Russian state is currently carrying out are on its own side.
So what happens to the Wagner group now, Owen, that has lost so many of its senior officials?
I think it's just going to be taken over by greedy Russian officers. I mean, for many years, Wagner has actually been a kind of, it's like passing go on the monopoly board. A lot of top Russian commanders actually were seconded, spent 6 months with Wagner in Africa, in Syria, made a lot of money. That was how Wagner actually became so influential among the senior high command. And in fact, one of the top commanders of Wagner was in fact literally a former deputy defense minister of the Russian Federation. So there's, there are a lot of people who have benefited from this cash cow now that because Wagner has been very busy hoovering up, gold mines, assets, gas wells in all the countries, from Niger to Central African Republic to Libya to Syria, where it's had operations. I think that business empire is just going to be absorbed by, vultures. In terms of its continuing existence as a threat to Putin, I mean, I don't think it's actually going to be reconstituted in its old form. It can't be. And that just leaves a sort of a major gap in the sort of fighting in the line of battle in Ukraine, because Prigozhin, for all of his many legion faults, was actually indeed one of the most effective battlefield commanders around Soledar and Bakhmut, and one of the few Russian generals that was actually able to deliver some kind of victory, however bloody it was, but that's now gone.
So
there's now no one else.
So you do think that this assassination will essentially have a direct effect on Putin's war against Ukraine?
The effect already happened after the mutiny, and when Wagner was essentially sort of dispersed and officially taken over by the Russian state. So Wagner hasn't been in the line of battle for some time, not in fact since the end of May. it's not really the issue of Wagner fighting forces. It's the effect on the Russian war effort, I think, is going to be more about, how is Putin going to where is Putin going to get his cannon fodder from? Because Wagner was a really important source of cannon fodder. They recruited, as we know, tens of thousands of violent criminals, including murderers and rapists, and offered them unconditional discharge after 6 months of service. So you have a cannon fodder problem, and you have a who to blame problem, because the arguments that Putin, the Prigozhin made, and the criticism he made of the Russian high command, all those things that he said have not been addressed and not been fixed, that the army is corrupt, it's inefficient, they don't know how to fight. All of those things are true. So if the operation still continues to go wrong, or rather if they still, continue to lose bits and pieces of ground to the Ukrainians, then Putin's going to have to come up with a new narrative, someone else to blame.
My last question to you, Owen, was something interesting that stuck out in your piece, where you wrote that Prigozhin's assassination could actually be interpreted as a sign of weakness from Vladimir Putin. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, weakness insofar as in the sort of mafia-like world of the inner circle of Putin's closest associates, what's most important is personal trust. They value loyalty above everything. And part of that loyalty is giving your word. So let's just imagine for a second, this actually is literally a mafia family. The boss has made a deal with a discontented capo, a lieutenant who's rebelled and been forgiven and is, has his guard down, and then you assassinate him while his guard is down. You've broken your word. What does that do to your negotiating capabilities in future with your other capos? Clearly what you've done is you've just murdered a man who trusted you. So in that sense, in the terms of the what the Russians call понятия, the understandings, not the laws, but the understandings that govern that sort of world of the high elite, Putin has actually just gone back on his word and proved himself to be fundamentally untrustworthy. And I think that is, if not necessarily a sign of weakness, it's a sign of his. It's going to weaken him in future. I mean, the weakness is really that it fails. It proves that Russia is a failed state that has no mechanism other than murder to punish its wrongdoers. That's really the sign of weakness.
Owen, thanks for joining Spectator TV.
My great pleasure.